Welcome to the space between. I'm glad you're here. Pull up a chair. Take a slow breath with me. One of the things I have learned about retirement is that sometimes the transitions begins long before we realize it. Most of us imagine retirement starts the day we leave our job. The retirement party, the last day, the farewell speech, the gold watch. Don't think we do that anymore. But looking back, I can see that my retirement transition began years before I officially retired. I just didn't recognize it at the time. It started with exhaustion and a lake. For years, I traveled regularly from South Florida to Tallahassee for meetings with child welfare leaders and state officials. The work mattered. I believed in it deeply, but the pace was relentless. Early morning flights, laptop open before takeoff, emails in the air, meetings all day, and then another hotel room that looked exactly like the last one. Too cold, too loud. Staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, trying to sleep, but instead replaying conversations, decisions, problems, things I needed to fix, things I should have said, things I needed to worry about tomorrow. And my body was keeping score. I was just not listening. I had had high blood pressure, persistent fatigue, and I seemed to get sick after every trip to Tallahassee. At the time, I viewed these things as inconveniences, not information. I thought I could outwork exhaustion. A lot of high achievers believe that. Ironically, Tallahassee had not always represented stress. More than 40 years earlier, I had arrived here as a student at Florida State University. I fell in love with the canopy roads, the campus, the excitement of learning. And even back then, I heard people talk about a beautiful lake west of town called Lake Talquin. I never made time to visit. I was too busy. Decades later, I was still too busy, but then one day after another trip left me exhausted and sick. My husband suggested something simple. He said, "Why don't you skip the hotel?" And so I did. I rented a small Airbnb on Lake Talquin. And honestly, I thought I was just changing accommodations. What I did not realize was that something much bigger was beginning. The first evening, I sat on the dock, overlooking the water. The sun was slowly dropping behind the trees. The lake was calm. Nobody was in a hurry. And for the first time in a very long time, I exhaled. Not a little breath, a real exhale, the kind that comes from somewhere deep inside. My body knew something before my mind did. It said, "We're safe here." I had nothing in my hands. No phone, no laptop, not even a Diet Coke. Just stillness. And what surprised me most was how unfamiliar that felt. Because in South Florida, there's always noise. Traffic, sirens, airplanes, activity. Even when I was supposedly resting, my mind was still working, still solving, still carrying, still planning. On that dock, the loudest sound was often a fish jumping into the water or a bird calling from the trees. The silence was not empty, it was restorative. And slowly another realization began to emerge. I had been carrying responsibility for so long that I no longer remembered what it felt like to set it down. Not solve it, not manage it, not prepare for it, not just to set it down for a few moments. There was nothing to fix, no deadline, no crisis, no decision, no one needing anything from me, just the water and the trees, and a deep breath I did not know that I had been holding. At the time, I thought Lake Talquin was helping me recover between meetings. But looking back, I think it was teaching me how to live differently. Because after that first visit, I kept returning. My husband joined me, And eventually we started talking about buying a small place, then building a home, then moving. Not because we had a grand retirement plan, but because something about that life felt right. The more time I spent there, the harder it became to leave. The pace was slower. The forest seemed endless. People waved at one another. Neighbors talked. Folks had time. And I found myself watching retired people living lives that looked very different from mine. In the mornings, they were kayaking, and in the evenings, they were sitting on docks, watching sunsets, laughing, fishing, sharing stories. And I found myself wondering something. What exactly do retired people do all day? Retirement seemed like something that had happened to other people, but certainly not me. What I understood now was that my life was already beginning to rearrange itself. Researcher Bruce Feiler calls this period the messy middle, that place where the old life no longer quite fits, but the new life has not fully emerged. Looking back, that is exactly where I was. I thought I was making practical decisions, buying property, building a home, moving to a different town. What I was actually doing was rehearsing for a different life. Around that same time, I read Arthur C. Brooks' book, From Strength to Strength. And one idea stopped me in my tracks. Brooks described what psychologists call fluid intelligence, the ability to think quickly, solve problems, manage complexity, make rapid decisions. For many professionals, those skills become the foundation of a successful career. Brooks points out that the research shows that fluid intelligence often begins a gradual decline sometime in midlife. It doesn't disappear, but it declines. At first, I resisted that idea. I thought, well, that can't be me. But the more I reflected on it, the more I realized he was describing something I had already been feeling. I could still do the work. I was still effective, still leading, still solving problems and producing results. But it was costing me more. The pace that once energized me was exhausting me. The constant decisions, the endless responsibility, the nonstop problem solving. I was spending more energy to produce the same outcome. And maybe that was part of what Lake Talquin was trying to teach me. Not that something was wrong, not that I was failing, but that life was asking something different from me. Because Brooks says the second half of life invites us into another kind of intelligence, crystallized intelligence. This is wisdom, perspective, pattern recognition, teaching, mentoring, meaning. Not less valuable, just different. Looking back, I can see that I was trying to hold on to one way of living while life was quietly inviting me into another. The lake was not a destination. It was a clue. My growing love of nature was a clue. My desire for more quiet time was a clue. My interest in reading and writing and walking and reflecting was a clue. Even my restlessness was a clue. The fact that I kept returning to that dock was a clue. Life was beginning to ask a question before I was ready to answer it. And eventually, that question led me toward retirement. Not because I was running away from work. I loved my work. But because I was beginning to feel called towards something else. Towards more space, more reflection, more presence, more meaning. So here is the retirement lesson I want to leave you with today. Retirement did not begin with a resignation letter. It began with a longing for a different life. Looking back, I can see that the transition had already begun. Before I made a decision, before I retired, before I knew what came next. Life was already leaving clues. For me, those clues arrived in moments of exhaustion, in the quiet of a lake at sunset, and in a growing desire for more space, more meaning, and a different way of living. The signs were there long before I knew how to interpret them. Maybe they're showing up in your life too. Remember, our job is not to force the flame. Our job is to protect the space that allows it to find its way. If you know someone else navigating this uncertain middle, invite them here. And if this resonated, please hit like and subscribe. It helps others find their way to this space too. We'll learn in public, we'll rest on purpose, and we'll get braver together. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Winter, and this is The Space Between.